So we left off with the Ottoman Empire reaching its apex. At some point, though, decline begins to set in, as inevitably happens with empires. Uh, of course, it's kind of hard to set a specific date as to when that was, and much of this reflects a kind of hindsight, but some historians feel that things started moving in the other direction with the Battle of Lepanto in 1571, which marked a major naval defeat of the Ottoman Empire by Spain, after which Spain really becomes the dominant power in the Mediterranean. But this is going to be a very kind of long, gradual process. And we should bear in mind the Ottoman Empire is going to carry on right up through World War I. So whatever failings it might have had, on the whole, is still going to be around for quite a while. One very important development, though, that is later going to become a basis for growing European interference in the Ottoman Empire, is the capitulations. The capitulations, which the word literally meaning chapter, or in this case chapters, referring to special charters or grants made by various sultans granting Christian nations certain rights and privileges with respect to trading in territory part of the Ottoman Empire. So kind of the idea is that if and the first country to receive such privileges was France. This was at the time of Suleiman the Magnificent, and reflected the alliance that he had with the French king at the time, Francis I. We talked already about the fact that they had allied with one another in opposition to the Habsburgs. So the basic idea there was that, for instance, if you were a French merchant and you were operating in Ottoman territory, you would not. It's almost like diplomatic immunity. You wouldn't be subject to Ottoman taxes. You wouldn't be subject to Ottoman law. Obviously, that would give you certain advantages. Now, initially, the capitulations were supposed to run in both directions, but over time, increasingly, they worked to the benefit of the various European powers that were granted these rights and privileges. So France was the first one, but far from the last. So this would give foreign European merchants tremendous advantages with respect to their Ottoman counterparts. And at some point, Europeans would begin extending the terms of the capitulations to Ottoman Christians and even Jews, who would very often act as kind of middlemen of European merchants. So they too would end up benefiting from this. And as you might imagine, that would become a major source of resentment if you were a Muslim merchant and you saw that your Christian and Jewish competitors were not subjected to the same taxes, enjoyed certain privileges, extraterritorial rights, and so forth. This would be really hard to compete with. And later on, the Europeans would also use this as an excuse for interfering in internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire, the idea that they had the right to protect those who were subject to the capitulations. Another problem is also going to be kind of declining quality of sultans. This is actually pretty typical with empires. You very often have this kind of pattern where the first series of rulers are very effective, but then at some point, part of the problem is that if you're a future ruler, in this case sultan, that you have very little governing experience by the time you take the throne. You're growing up in a palace environment, so you're kind of out of touch with what's going on in the empire. So in the Ottoman case, I mean, they're kind of able to get by because they do have a series of very effective grand viziers who govern on behalf of the sultans. So that really does kind of cover up a bit for what's lacking there. A really good example is Mehmed Koprulu, the Grand Vizier from 1656 until his death in 1661. And he actually came through the Devshirme system, so he had originally been from a Christian family, but then trained in administration in the palace school. And during his reign, he proved to be very effective. He was able to kind of arrest the decline for a bit, restore some prestige and power. So there were a number of military victories at this time. In terms of overall things are moving in the other direction, with more defeats than victories. Also kind of stabilizing things internally. Then you have Fezl Ahmed, who succeeded his father, and that's the son. in 1661. He proved to be pretty effective as well. It was during this period that the Ottoman Empire captured the island of Crete in 1669, currently part of Greece. And there were occasionally effective sultans still, right? But they increasingly became few and far between. So Sultan Murad IV was able to kind of restore some authority to the state, partly because he was very ruthless and could be very brutal. He was only 11 when he took the throne, but he actually proved to be pretty effective. So he governed until 1640. And we should note that, at the time it wouldn't have been entirely clear that the Ottoman Empire was in decline, neither within the empire or from a European perspective. In fact, they laid siege to Vienna one last time in 1683, but that's definitely the last time the Ottoman Empire would prove a major threat to Europe. And again, I mean, they failed to take Vienna. But, at the time, if you were a European, it seemed that the Ottoman Empire was still a very formidable threat. Shortly after that, and really from this point forward, we're going to find that increasingly the Ottoman Empire is at war with Russia. Russia at this point is a very rapidly growing, very rapidly expanding empire, becoming very powerful, and often conquering territory at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. Though Austria-Hungary at that time, let's just say Austrian Empire, is also periodically a foe of the Ottoman Empire. So for instance, you have the Great Turkish War in 1699, which forced the Ottomans to give up a lot of territory to the Austrian Empire in Hungary, Transylvania, Morea, and Podolia. We'll come back to that later, this kind of problem of decline, and then at some point the question is going to be what to do about it. And at some point there will be a recognition that perhaps Europe has somehow advanced past the Ottoman Empire, and perhaps they have something to learn from Europe. Before we do that, though, we need to look at the other great empire from this period in the Middle East, and that would be the Safavids, the imperial homeland of which corresponds roughly to Iran. Now the Safavids, the ruling dynasty, actually started out as a Sufi order, the Safavid Sufi order, which had flourished in Azerbaijan since the early 14th century. It was founded by a Persian mystic named Safiuddin, and so this was in the Iranian Azerbaijan province, and you can see it on the map there, not corresponding to the present-day country of Azerbaijan, which would be right over the border. Now around this time, much of what today is Iran had been under the control of a Mongol dynasty, the Timurids, which at its greatest height had included the whole of Central Asia, Iran, and much of Afghanistan, as well as territory corresponding roughly to present-day Iraq and the Caucasus region. That would be today the countries of, say, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Armenia. And so it was against this backdrop that the Safavids rose. So what happened? At some point, the head of the Safavid order, a fellow named Sheikh Junaid, transformed the religious order into a political power. So they became much more militant. They formed alliances with other groups. Most notably would be the Kizilbash, the name reflecting the headgear they wore. It literally means red heads, and they wore these red caps that had 12 points, reflective of the fact that they were 12 Shiites. So each point representing a Shiite imam. And they were extremely militant. So they were part of this kind of growing alliance. And then, you also had, as part of the alliance, so it's kind of a confederation of different groups, but in some cases, various kind of tribal federations like the Akkayunlu, also known as the White Sheep, and they were a Turkoman tribal federation. And so this kind of allowed the Safavids to become a very potent political and military power through these alliances. And eventually they established their authority over a good part of what today is Iran. Now, up until this point, and most people today know that, if they know something about the Middle East, they know that Iran is predominantly Shiite. Very often they imagine that was always the case, but until now, they were predominantly Sunni. And it's in fact the Safavids that are going to forcibly transform Iran into a Shiite state, basically by forcing everyone to convert. This happens under Ismail I, who by this time they've taken the title of Shah, so he is the ruler or Shah from 1501 to 1524. You could say he's kind of, this really does reflect when it effectively becomes a dynastic empire. So he relocated the capital to Tabriz, which is kind of in the northwest corner of present-day Iran, and then established Shiism as the official religion of Iran. He himself claimed to be descended from the Imam Ali and his wife Fatima through the seventh Imam Musa al-Kazim. But they're not Seveners, right? They didn't believe that that was the official line of descent for the Imams, even if they claim themselves to be descended from that particular Imam, right? So, in terms of their religious beliefs, they carried on through the 12th hidden Imam. And you might be wondering, well, what does it mean to forcibly convert an entire state? It would have started with the ulama, right? And to some sense, if you bring the ulama over, it's pretty much short order before you bring everyone else. So if you were a member of the ulama, you basically had one of three choices. You could either die a martyr, you could go into exile and leave, or you could convert. And eventually, quite a large number of them did convert, and eventually this became the means by which to transform the whole state into a Shiite state. And I should note that, today Shiism, is fully embraced in Iran, is very much a part of Iranian identity. And the fact that even until this point, Iranians saw themselves as very distinct from neighboring Arabs, that might have been a factor in kind of the ease of transformation to Shiism. In any event, just so you know where Tabriz is, right, so that's off in the northwest corner, the present-day capital of Iran, Tehran, at this point, a small village, right? So that isn't going to become the capital until much later. And then just to clarify the fact that they're Twelvers, right? So you can see the seventh Imam Musa al-Kazim, whom the Safavid Shahs claim to be descended from, but not through the official line of Imams, right? The Imamate going down to the 12th Imam, al-Muntazir, who they believe to be in a state of hiding or occultation. Now, eventually, they're going to come into conflict with the Ottomans, and we already talked about the first major encounter, the Battle of Chaldiran, on August 23rd, 1514, which the Ottomans won decisively, right? But from this point on, you really have this kind of idea that, the one power represents Sunnism and the other power represents Shiism, right? So that becomes kind of a defining aspect of how they perceive one another. And we talked already about how, to some extent, this battle determined what would become the border between modern-day Turkey and Iran, to some extent between Iraq and Iran as well, and definitely between the Sunni Arab world and the Shia Iranian world. In the meantime, Sufism actually fell out of favor to some extent. It was seen as potentially competing with Shiism, both of them, kind of reflecting certain kind of mystical ideas related to Islam. And might not be an accident that a Sufi order eventually transformed into a Shiite state. The only Sufi order that would persist, and partly because it became kind of the official Sufi order that was sanctioned by the Safavids, was the Nimatullahi Sufi order, named after its founder, Nur al-Din Nimatullah Wali, sometimes referred to as the Shah Nimatullah. And so even until the 1970s, this was actually the only Sufi order permitted to operate. And the majority of its members continued to reside in Iran. After the Iranian Revolution, they actually were frowned upon. And so they, most of their followers today reside outside of Iran, mostly in Europe, West Africa, and North America. Now, another important Shah would be Tahmasp I, who relocated the capital further inland to Kazvin, which is northwest of present-day Tehran, so to the north, but much further away from the frontier. And that was kind of the point, so as to better safeguard it against Ottoman attacks. And, well, that brings us to the individual generally considered to be the greatest of Safavid Shahs, Abbas I, sometimes known as Abbas the Great. And so this was definitely a period when the Safavid Empire was flourishing, partly in connection with the relocation again of the capital to Isfahan, further in the interior. That would become kind of a flourishing cultural and intellectual center, and today a very popular tourist destination if you should manage to get into Iran. He took the throne after the forced abdication of his father, Shah Muhammad Khudabanda. But he was also great because, in terms of, the kind of traditional ways in which we evaluate greatness back in the day, expanding the empire, greatly strengthening the military through reform. And that kind of brings us to a very interesting story regarding two English brothers who would prove instrumental in this reform. They were travelers and adventurers who went to Persia in 1598, ended up being hired by the Shah to train the Persian army, and introduced many aspects of kind of how things worked in England in terms of rules and customs, and definitely also kind of upgraded the Safavid military in terms of artillery. There clearly was a recognition after their defeat by the Ottoman that they needed to catch up in terms of gunpowder technology. But one other really important reform is going to be the creation of a fighting elite, very much the equivalent, the Safavid equivalent of the Janissaries. So kind of even in terms of how they actually recruit people. So again, it's going to be young Christians that are recruited at an early age, converted to Islam, and then eventually trained to be ghulams. Again, kind of the Persian or Safavid equivalent of Janissaries. Most of these are coming from Armenian, Georgian, or Circassian Christian communities. And here we see a map of the Safavid Empire at its greatest extent. So you can see definitely, at the center, territory roughly corresponding to present-day Iran, but also bringing in territory corresponding to Afghanistan, parts of Central Asia, and much of Iraq. And we already mentioned that territory in Iraq very often going back and forth between the Ottoman Empire and the Safavid Empire, which might explain why you have large numbers of Shiite Arabs in the south. After Abbas, things are pretty much downhill from there. One problem is going to be that the Safavids are being squeezed from two sides. To the north, we have an expanding Russian empire that is really moving in and taking over large chunks of Central Asia. On the other end, we have a newly established Muslim empire in India, the Mughal Empire, which is also expanding northward, later on to be replaced by the British, but basically going to be the same problem with respect to Persia. The end finally comes in rather rocky fashion at the hand of a fellow named Nadir Shah. The Safavids had actually been taken over briefly by Afghanis who invaded the empire and then had taken control of the country briefly. But then Nadir Shah, who was a Safavid, he was kind of a military leader, head of Khorasan, a vassal state of the Safavids. He's able to drive out the Afghans and then effectively takes control of the country himself under the nominal leadership of a Safavid Shah. Then later as regent for the infant Abbas III. He's later assassinated, and the Safavids will become Shahs briefly again. But this whole episode pretty much kind of destabilized everything. So to the extent that the Safavids really aren't able to maintain power. And they're eventually replaced by the Zand dynasty, which rules very briefly, and the Zand are in turn replaced by the Qajar dynasty. And the Qajar dynasty will carry on until pretty much the beginning of the 20th century. And will have to contend with, much like the Ottoman Empire, the growing influence of Europe. So this brings us to the end of the second part of our lecture on the Ottoman and Safavid empires. Do make sure that you saw the first part first. I probably should have said this at the beginning, but hopefully it's pretty clear regarding the sequence. And I'll be talking to you soon.